You're listening to the Vint Wine Podcast, where you'll hear interviews and stories from around the wine world. From writers and critics to winemakers and sommeliers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping wine culture. Enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Vint Wine Podcast. I am your host, Billy Galenko, and today we are back with another returning guest, John Szabo. He is a volcanic wine expert. He's also a wine writer up in Canada, and he is Hungarian and used to own vineyards in Hungary. We have a fantastic conversation. If you haven't listened to our first episode with John, I highly recommend going back and listening to that as well. He is a wealth of knowledge about volcanic wines. Also, since we've last had him on, I was able to get my hands on a copy of his book, Volcanic Wines, Salt, Grit, and Power. The book itself is gorgeous. It was released a few years ago. There's a few more copies that are available online. For a while there were hundreds of dollars because there were so few copies available because the book is out of print. But he let us know that he's also making a digital version. So keep your eyes out for that as well. But in this conversation, we cover a little bit of a Volcanic Wines 101. We recap a few things that we discussed on the last episode, discuss what volcanic wines are, where you can find them. And then we also dove into what the impact of volcanic soils, the various types of them, have on the wines themselves. It was a fantastic interview. I wanted to speak with him because volcanic wines are having a bit of a moment here in 2025. I don't know if you've seen the Wine Enthusiast article or other publications talking about it, but volcanic wine has been everything people want to talk about these days. I've also even started seeing here in Los Angeles, the words volcanic soils next to wines at random wine bars I've been at, which I think is fascinating and I'm really excited about because I've long been a fan. For me, the wines always just have this savory, almost saline-like nature. Can't exactly explain what it is, but a lot of my favorite wines come from either wines grown on or near active volcanoes or even extinct volcanoes. Everything from Tokaj to Madeira to Etna in Sicily. There's so many wines and so many regions that I absolutely love, and I found that there was a through line of volcanic soils through all of them. John gives us a great breakdown of those. He talks a little bit about how he's also seeing the popularity in volcanic wines rise. We talk a bit about Hungarian wines as well and a little bit more detail. And yeah, it's a fantastic conversation. And John is just always able to pack a ton of information into just a short amount of time. So I found myself learning a ton. And if you are in Los Angeles, he's also hosting a Hungarian wine seminar on November 13th. It is in West Hollywood. If you are interested in attending, let me know via email at billy@sommeliermedia.com. I believe it's for trade only. I'm very excited about checking that out next week. And now we will just get right to John's interview. We had a great conversation and covered so much. I hope everybody enjoys, learns a lot, and goes and checks out some volcanic wines. Here is John Szabo, master sommelier and volcanic wine expert. Hi, John. Thanks so much for joining again.
Hey, my pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm really excited since we've last had you on. I think volcanic wines have really come into the global wine zeitgeist, and I have acquired a copy of your book, which I am very excited about. So I'm glad to have you back.
Hey, glad you found a copy of the book. It's been out of print for quite a while, and I think you can get used copies on Amazon. Did you get yours there?
Yeah, I found one on Amazon, but when you were last on, they were very rare. They were like hundreds of dollars. I was able to find one that was a little cheaper this time. It worked out.
Happy to hear that. Happy to hear that.
They were a hot commodity. Can you, just for a few of our new listeners who may not have been with us last time you joined, can you give a quick background on who you are, and then we'll dive in on everything that's going on?
Yeah, with pleasure. So my name is John Szabo. I'm a master sommelier based in Toronto, Canada. And I've been in the wine business for about a quarter of a century. Started my career in restaurants, as so many of us have, but in the kitchen, actually, rather than more front of the house. Obviously, spent some time on the floor as a sommelier, but more time cooking in kitchens. Worked in Toronto, worked in Niagara wine country, ended up in Paris, working in a couple of Michelin-starred restaurants there down in the south of France. And then, as careers often do, they took their own path and trajectory and ended up importing wine and then eventually writing about wine. And now most of my days are spent writing and reviewing wines for a company called WineAlign.com. We're Canada's most read wine publication, but it's online, so we've got readers all over the world. And we cover as much of the world of wine as we can.
Very nice, very nice. Is the WineAlign subscription only, or do you also have free for all?
Yeah, we've got the freemium model as well. So you just go and sign up. You can access all the content. Some of the reviews are held back for a period of time for premium members, and premium members get other perks as well. But check it out, WineAlign.com, as in we align, because there are several critics and we all review the same wines, and sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't. And as a reader, as a taster, as a consumer, you can buy wine, look at those two different reviews, and align with the critics whose tastes best match yours, which I think is brilliant, because we have to concede that wine is very subjective, very, very personal. As much as we try and make it technical and absolute, it's simply not that.
I had no idea that was why it was called that. That makes so much sense. In my head, I was like, oh, and then you align with whichever critic you like the most. And then I was like, oh my God, WineAlign. So good.
Yeah, it's very liberating for me. I don't have to try and pretend to be everything to everyone. I can let my preferences hang out there for all to see.
Very nice, very nice. Over the years, you've also become kind of the volcanic wine guru and global wine specialist. Can you talk a little bit about your book and then what's new about it? You're coming out with a new digital copy as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. The idea for the book came around about 15 years or so ago now, just writing a short little article, end of the year thing on my favorite wines and trying to be a little bit more clever than the average. I had recently visited Santorini, had tasted some wines from Etna. I'm Hungarian by background and go to Hungary quite often and tasted some stuff from Balaton and Tokaj. And it just finally dawned on me that what unified all of these incredibly different regions was the fact that they were volcanic in origin. Some active, some a little bit less. And so that was my article. My favorite wine grows on the side of a volcano, which kind of piqued the interest of the editor that I was writing for at the time. So she asked me to do a full-length article to expand on that a little bit. And as I was researching that, I realized, my goodness, there's such an amazingly wide and diverse world of wines grown in volcanic regions, made from grapes grown on volcanic soil. And that's how I got the idea to write the book.
Very nice. And then, so with this newer digital, like I said, number one, people are still clamoring for the editions that are in print. So is that what inspired you, or not in print, were printed? Is that what is inspiring the digital release, and what extra content will be in the new version?
What inspired the digital release is that the print version, as you learned at least a couple of months ago, was selling for ridiculous prices. And this is information. This is a passion of mine that I wanted to share with as many people as possible. And with the tools available today to make a digital version, I thought it would be simple. You've got the book there. It's a big hardcover with plenty of photographs, and the layout was very specific and nicely designed. To render that on a digital side has taken much longer than anticipated. It'll be out any day now, quite literally, and it'll be the original version. But to that, I intend to add some new chapters, some volcanic regions I've since visited that didn't make it into the first version, and then update the producer sections. The nice thing about the way it was written is that, first of all, the geology doesn't really change. Maybe we could argue that things are a little different on it and now than they were 10 years ago. A couple of new lava flows and deposits of ash, but by and large, the meat of the book hasn't really changed, doesn't need to be updated. But what has changed is the number of producers working in these regions and the incredible wines they're making and varieties that they're reviving from near extinction. Yeah, expect some producer updates and then a few new regions to be added in, chapter by chapter.
When we talk about volcanic wine regions a little further on here, we'll maybe touch on a couple of those newer ones. Before, I did want to talk about volcanic wines in general, but I do have a pressing question about Santorini, because I was just reading some articles about how they're on the precipice of potential total disaster in terms of the vines and not production, or reducing production. What is the scene looking like there in Santorini?
I don't want to cast a shadow on the island. It's one of my favorite places in the world, but I was speaking to some producers. I was in Greece this summer, And the situation is pretty dire. Yields have dropped year over year thanks to a fairly prolonged drought. And I think the figure I heard this year was that maybe 300 tons were harvested on the entire island. Wow. And the other big problem, which they're addressing, maybe not urgently enough, is just the rampant over-tourism that the island's been experiencing. When I've been there have been multiple massive cruise ships parked in the caldera, disembarking thousands of people on the island. It's a huge tax on the infrastructure. And on the flip side, if you're an islander, where's your easy money to be made? It's catering to that tourist market. You rip out a vineyard, put up a hotel, and you're in pretty good shape financially. So there's pressure on vineyard land. You need to protect that vineyard land, otherwise it's going to disappear. And the other problem is irrigation that they're starting to look very seriously at now. In fact, they've already got plans for a water desalination plant, specifically for, not only for, but also for vineyards, because otherwise even the root systems that are 300-400 years old, those vines are suffering.
So even the already low margins are going to get smaller, at least for the short term, while you have to pay for irrigation and desalination.
I can tell you Santorini grapes are already the most expensive in the world, certainly that I've ever heard of. This year, they were going for 10 or 11 euros a kilo, which is enormous. To give you a sense of reference, your most expensive grapes in Champagne might be 6, 7, 8 euros a kilo. So this is almost double what you're paying for Champagne grapes. And by simple calculations, if you take the Napa model, usually it's 10 times what you pay per kilo. So if you pay $10 a kilo for your Napa cab, then you're selling that bottle for 100. By the same logic, Santorini wine should be selling for 100, 110, 120, which is a massive stretch. I remember the days where you could get a brilliant white Santorini Assyrtiko for $18.95 in the Canadian market, under $20. Those days are long gone.
Yeah, those really weren't that long ago. I think I remember in New York, I was able still to find some Assyrtiko pretty cheap from Santorini.
Yeah, but it'll trickle down. So if you got some in your cellar, cherish it. If you can find some on the shelves for a reasonable price, buy it up, is my recommendation.
I may actually go on a search and do that. All right, cool. So taking a step back, Volcanic Wines, like I mentioned earlier, I've obviously been a fan for a long time. We had you on a couple of years ago, but now I feel like it's really coming into its moment. Can you talk a little bit about how we're balancing the new conversation about people wanting to learn and drink volcanic wines, but also maybe using it as a marketing tool rather than a scientific fact?
Yeah, that's a great question. Great distinction to be made. From my perspective, it was always a passion and a search for brilliant wines that happen to come from volcanic soils, not really to create a marketing message, but it has, to some degree, I think, become that. And I'm partly responsible for that, for better or for worse, I would say. And you're quite right. In the last 6 months, really, the number of requests for interviews, for magazines, for podcasts has spiked. I don't really know what it's been in 2025, but it seems to be the year of the volcanic wine. And I've seen countless articles in pretty big publications. Wine Enthusiast did a big splash on volcanic wines. Drinks Business over in the UK has done a few, and every other country from France to Hungary to all sorts of parts of the world. So yeah, there seems to be a real groundswell of a movement, and I can't pinpoint the origin of that, but delighted to see people discovering these wines. So is it marketing or is it facts and reality? And the answer is, I think a little bit of both. Maybe we can talk about this new volcanic certification. I know you know a little bit about that. So an association in the center of France, in the Côte d'Auvergne region, right in the Massif Central, which is a beautiful volcanic region, not covered in the book, but will be one of the new chapters. Fabulous landscape of about 80 extinct volcanoes. Anyhow, a group there was formed about 5-6 years ago called Vinora. You can look them up online. They've got some pretty detailed information on their website. And I went to an event there in 2020, I think it was, just January 2020, before everything shut down. And we did this wonderful event in a volcanic theme park, which was pretty cool. And at that point, the head of Vinora, Pierre Desclas, his name, he said, "John, what do you think about some kind of certification, some sort of sticker to authenticate these wines?" Because even at that point, they were questionable regions who wanted to jump on the volcanic wagon, so to speak. I said, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Let me know if I can help. Keep me posted. And heard nothing. And 5 years later, I got the the press release and the invitation to the release of this new Volcanic Origin certification, which I think is great, mostly because it's actually serious. It's rigorously done. It's open to producers anywhere in the world with bona fide volcanic soils, making wines from grapes grown on them. And in some instances where it might be questionable, they'll request you to submit soil samples. They've got a team of geologists on their panel in order to verify the authenticity of the volcanic origins. And then if that all goes well, then you get your little sticker. So it's nothing to do with quality. In fact, it's like any appellation system, any AOC or DOC, DOCG, never guarantees quality. I think that's maybe what confuses some people. It just guarantees authenticity, guarantees origin, guarantees a certain method of production. In the case of the volcanic origin, it's really just a guarantee of volcanic authenticity. After that, it's up to the consumer to decide whether it's good or not good, worth the money or not.
When they go and verify with the geologists, I should actually know the term of this because we just had Brenna Quigley, who is a terroir specialist, on the podcast. But so are they digging soil pits? And I can't remember what the core sample type thing is, but are they actually going in and like digging way down, or are they just taking surface samples?
That's a detail I don't know, Billy. In certain regions, there's really no questioning the volcanicness of them. I think of the Canary Islands or the Azores. Those are just peaks of volcanoes sticking out of the sea. Etna, pretty obviously volcanic. But you get into some areas of mixed geology and it gets a lot more muddy, let's say there. Thinking of Northern California, Sonoma, Napa, where there's some fantastic volcanics, but not only, there's all sorts of other stuff there. So the depth to which they dig, I can't really answer that. That's a good question. I'll look into that. But as I said, at least they've got a serious panel assembled of geologists. These are not wine people necessarily. They're experts in soil and rocks.
Yeah, cool. So let's dive into that a little bit. How when you're thinking about volcanic wines, is there a distinct character to wines that are grown on, say, extinct volcanoes or in this mixed geology area versus something that's either active or was active in the near past?
Aside from the imagination of the drinker, of the consumer, Etna is the perfect example. It seems to erupt every other week or so. So that's become an emblematic, iconic region of volcanic wines because it's an active volcano. Whereas other regions you might not even know are volcanic. How many people know that parts of Sonoma are extremely volcanic, or the Mayacamas in Napa Valley, very volcanic? Lake County may be a little bit more obvious because that region powers the largest geothermal power plant in the world, powers about 1 million homes in San Francisco. So it's a very active area of geology. But in terms of how that impacts the flavor of the wine, I couldn't make any sort of categoric statement about active volcanoes produce this flavor profile and extinct produce that. It's not that simple, as we know in the world of wine. C'est compliqué, as they love to say in France, and it really is. It has more to do with the chemical composition of the volcanic material that was ejected and how long it's been around and how much of the rock has turned into soil or the ash has turned into soil.
That said, are there sensory kind of hallmarks that you find that you are personally able to find in like a volcanic wine? Are there any through lines you think, or is it just something that like it's a character in terms of like balance and it gives off a certain essence?
Yeah, that's maybe the only question that matters, right? What does a volcanic wine taste like? Is it recognizable? I'll give you two answers. The first is that, as I say in the first line of the book, there's no such thing as volcanic wine. It's a strange way to start off a book on volcanic wines, but my point is that there is such a thing as volcanic wines in the plural. But within this world, this family of volcanic wines, there's huge diversity, right? You're everywhere from subtropical Canary Islands to northern Germany, right, where the climate is radically different. And then we're talking literally hundreds of different grape varieties, different techniques, different traditions and cultures and so on. So that's why I say it's not a niche category whatsoever. So that's maybe a dissatisfying answer. But the good news is that over my years of tasting volcanic wines, by and large, and I think we discussed this last time I was on, if you to divide the world of wine into two massive hemispheres of flavor, on the one hand, you've got your wines that are predominantly fruity, and on the other hand, you've got wines that are predominantly savory. And in my experience, volcanic wines are almost invariably on the savory side of the spectrum. Of course, there's overlap. There's fruit in volcanic wines, and there's stony savory characters in fruity wines, but there's two two main hemispheres, and these are savory for sure.
That's very helpful. Yeah, I tried to pigeonhole again Brenna when we had her on recently about this as well, and she was like, the only thing I got out of her is if you grow the same grapes on a volcanic soil and a non-volcanic soil, say like a limestone, there will be less acidic on the volcanic soils than it would be on the limestone. And that's the only thing. She was like, chemistry wise, that's how it should work. It's obviously not a hard and fast rule. So I was like, okay.
Yeah, that's entirely true in my experience. So not just talking about flavors, I've actually read a lot of research and done my own research. So with the same group of Vinora, although I wasn't part of this Volcanic Origin certification, I was part of a study that was conducted there, sponsored by Vinora and the region in France where they are. And I worked with a professor of chemistry from University of Montreal here in Canada, and also a professor from Dijon. So the three of us, I was the wine guy, but these two are also wine people, but with the scientific cred to stick it all together. And we did a pretty in-depth research project, starting with soil, doing chemical analysis of the soil, then the grapes themselves, the must, and then the finished wine at a couple of different stages. And then we wrapped that all up with an organoleptic tasting of these wines. So we compared Gamay, specifically in this case, grown on the limestones of Côte d'Auvergne, which are side by side with various types of volcanic. We picked basalt in this case. And we measured everything up over a couple of vintages. Everything on the winemaking side was identical. And we observed some trends starting to emerge. For example, the Gamay grown on the volcanics had a different color. Starting from the most basic thing, the color was red but more in the yellow spectrum versus the limestone, which was red but more in the blue spectrum. If you can picture that, if you've looked at a bunch of red wines, maybe that's less interesting than some of the other things we found, which was, yes, quite right. The pH was always a little higher in the basalts, which makes perfect sense. If you think of the color of basalt, it's a dark stone that weathers into dark earth, which absorbs much more heat and gives that heat back to the vine. So ripeness is maybe pushed a little bit further. And then beyond that, there were some microelements that probably have no impact on taste that were measurably different in the two wines. Organoleptically, we found that the Gamays on basalt were more peppery. Gamay is a grape with a lot of rotundone, that molecule that gives pepper, the smell of pepper, like in Syrah, Gamay, Pinot Noir. And these were more peppery, so more spicy, you could say. Less fruity, more savory. So there's something there. There's something there. That works when you're comparing side by side in the same region, everything being equal. When you're comparing Napa to Yarra Valley, it's a bit more of a distant connection.
Yeah, no, that's a really fascinating test there. Cool. I'll have to go try to find and read more about that. I want to talk about regions now. Let's instead of starting with the most well-known, let's talk about some of the regions that maybe people, I know we've touched on a few of these in the last episode. Everybody should go listen to that. But maybe a few regions that people may not come right to mind as volcanic that in your mind are really producing great wines right now.
Areas of no longer active volcanoes. And by the way, not even geologists, volcanologists can agree on what the timeline cutoff point for active versus dormant versus extinct is. Most of what I've seen points to around 10,000 years. If it hasn't erupted in 10,000 years, probably heading towards extinct. Dormant is a volcano that still has a magma chamber underneath that, and also showing a little bit of activity like geysers, volcanic gases, seismic activity. But in areas where volcanoes are truly extinct, and I'm thinking the Rhine Valley, for example, that little sliver of Alsace called Rongen de Tam, fantastic Alsatian Grand Cru right at the southern tip of the Vosges Mountains. That's volcanic, but probably, unless you've been there and spoke to producers, you wouldn't necessarily know that it's volcanic. Also, a few little vineyards in the Pfalz and the Mosel, also of volcanic origin, but we're talking 200 million year old volcanic soil. So not going to leap to mind as a volcanic terroir compared to Etna or the Canary Islands or Santorini or Vesuvius, Campi Flegrei around Naples. Those are areas of hyperactive geology. Certainly not extinct, certainly still active and perhaps problematic. I would point out Hungary as well as a great extinct volcanic terroir, but you can very clearly see in the landscape the classic form of stratovolcanoes and these other kind of weird flat top shaped hills on the north shores of Lake Balaton, this kind of trapezoidal shape hills that were formed from volcanism and eroded away into this curious shape. It's a really beautiful landscape, but extinct.
What are some Hungarian wines? This is just like a personal. I'm a very distant part Hungarian as well, and I've visited a few times, gotten to taste the wines. What are some wines in Hungary that are fantastic on volcanic soils that maybe aren't just Tokaj? They're not just sweet wines. They're not just Tokaj. Are there other ones that people should be looking for, different varieties as well?
I can tell you, having visited Tokaj many times, and most recently last week, there is a terrific movement, if you will, of dry wines. I'm sure you've tasted the odd dry Furmint or dry Harslevilu or dry blend. It's really become a focus of producers in the last 10 years or so, maybe we could say 15 years. The sweet wines are still the world's best, in my humble opinion, but the dry wines are now reaching a pretty critical mass and level of quality that's very exciting for me. These are very savory, botanical, I call them, white wines with fantastic salinity. Salinity is the new minerality, right? People are, in the last year, been the sapidity, the salinity, the saline quality of my wine rather than mineral, which everyone's moving away from. I've been using salty for 15 years now. It's finally catching up.
Yeah, I think number one, I think consumers, like you say that, and it's something that even if it's not just salt, you have to explain that, is much more understandable than minerality, because even wine people don't know what minerality is. And I think there's becoming this more acceptance in the wine world of minerality as like a texture thing rather than a taste thing. So I think it's like happening concurrently.
Let there be many definitions of it. Nobody needs to own the definition of minerality or salinity. But just to carry on, one other area I'd point out is the area of Badajoz. So we're on the north shores of Lake Balaton, which is Central Europe's largest lake, the remnants of the Pannon Sea, which is since mostly dried up. But this is that landscape of curious trapezoid-shaped extinct volcanoes, where, to give you an example, there are the native varieties, which I think are fantastic. Olas Riesling, aka Welsh Riesling, and Furmint, Harslevilu. But take an international variety like Sauvignon Blanc. There's a producer who's got Sauvignon Blanc planted on a volcano called the St. George Hill. And what I love about that wine is that it tastes almost nothing like Sauvignon Blanc. I give that to my wife, and I give it to her blind, of course, because she won't touch Sauvignon Blanc, doesn't like the flavors that you get from that variety most of the time. I give her that. My goodness, what is this? This is such an odd but amazing, delicious wine. It's Sauvignon Blanc, but it's from a volcanic terroir. So here's an example of the terroir, of the soil, of the region superseding any varietal characteristic. And that for me is exciting, because varietal character is okay. When you're paying at a certain price, you want originality, you want singularity.
Yeah. We'll continue on to other regions, but just because I'm a big fan of them, can you share a little bit about what a dry Furmint or a dry Harslevilu would taste like? A little bit.
Yes. So the brilliant thing about Furmint and why it made great sweet wines for centuries and still does is that it ripens to a pretty high degree. I'm talking 13.5%, 14% alcohol and a kind of average vintage, yet keeps a remarkably high acidity. So you've got this combination of kind of rich, full-bodied texture, and then this through line of acidity that just makes your mouth salivate. So you're already talking a great food wine here. And then in terms of flavor profile, it's not an aromatic variety, much more subtle, but you will find a little bit of kind of white-fleshed orchard fruit, pear, apple sort of flavors subtly. And then, for me, the more exciting side of the variety is I keep describing it as botanical. You walk into an herbalist shop and there's this mix of dried flowers, and it's not green in the sense that pyrazines of Sauvignon would be green. There's no vegetal green, but there's a greenness to it. Rather than the flowers, it's the flower stems, and it's very tonic. It's savory and quite delicious.
Yeah, huge fan of both Furmint and Harslevilu. Moving on now, I had another question. Are any red grapes grown on volcanic soils in Hungary?
Yeah, absolutely. In Balaton and in Tokaj. I mean,
like Kek Frankos, or?
Yeah, there's Kek Frankos in Balaton. In fact, there's a small little peninsula that juts out into the lake where there's this fantastic 1,000-year-old abbey called the Tokaj Abbey, and the peninsulas of the same name, Tokaj. And there's some great volcanic Kek Frankos being made specifically. But you'll find I've tasted Syrah and Tempranillo from that same volcano we were just talking about, which is pretty fascinating. And you'll find a little bit of Pinot Noir here and there. It's white wine country for the most part, but you'll find some.
I hope people people keep a look at. I've seen ferment pop, like the dry ferment, popping up more and more as with the current wine climate here in the U.S. People are having to get more creative with their wine lists, and I think they're able to bring in more ferment for a better price than maybe some white wines from France. So it's exciting to see it more often here.
Yeah, in fact, on that side note there, I'm actually coming down to the US in November for a tour of 4 cities to do Hungarian wine masterclasses. Hopefully I can catch you in LA. We'll be in LA mid-November. I can send you the exact date, but we've got to stop in New York, LA, Austin, and Chicago.
Cool. All through November. Yeah, awesome. We will be sure to put a link to, you have a website with that. We'll put a link in the show notes.
Thank you.
Okay, cool. I can cut that part out. Before moving on to other regions that I wanted to touch on, can you, with this rising popularity, it just reminded me that you have your Volcanic Wine Awards every year. I have not been able to make it. They've been in New York. But this year you're partnering with Jancis Robinson. Is that part of this new interest globally in volcanic wines? I feel like, or was the website, the organization just also wanted to promote them this year?
So there's the Volcanic Wines International Conference, which we've been running since 2018. Missed obviously a couple of years there. We skipped this year, and we'll be back in 2026 in June. But last year we decided to do for the first time this Volcanic Wine Awards, so the World Volcanic Wine Awards, and we partnered with Wine and Spirits magazine with Josh Green, who I've known for many, many years and wrote for several times. And we ran this awards. We brought in some really top-notch tasters from mostly the New York area, and we ran through, can't remember exactly how many submissions we got, but 300 or something like that. Wasn't massive, but it was not tiny either. And we published our top wines, our Medal Award-winning wines, our Chairman Award-winning wines from this wild volcanic world. And I love the idea. I love the tasting more than anything else. It was a terrific tasting. And it was just fascinating to see the opinions converge on this idea of what a volcanic wine is supposed to taste like. And I hadn't really anticipated this. But by the end of the third day of tasting, everyone was picking up and saying, okay, yeah, this is exactly what I expected. This for me is volcanic. And these were people who were not volcanic wine experts. They were just great wine tasters. And they all came into line, so to speak. I thought we should do this again. Wine and Spirits magazine shut down, unfortunately, as you probably know, but Josh moved over to the Jancis Robinson team. So that's where the connection came in. And he was keen to do it again. And so was Jancis and her crew. So for us, it's obviously a huge win to be able to work with such a prestigious publication with global reach, truly global reach. So I'm anticipating that it'll be a much larger awards this year, more comprehensive, which again is exciting.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you're going to get the two-prong, the wine enthusiasts who like to just read what they have on their website, but also people like me who are a little bit more nerdy who go there just to go on the Oxford Companion to Wines, like digital versions. I think you'll get a little bit of both, which will be really great.
Yeah. Wow.
Cool. So pivoting back to regions, I want to talk a little bit more about American wine regions that maybe folks may not know are volcanic, and a little bit about some of your work. I know you've done some work in California. I also wanted to talk a little bit about Oregon as well. Can you talk just a little bit about maybe some of these that people may not expect, and then maybe producers or wines that would look forward to that express the terroir really well?
Sure. We could start north and move south, starting in Washington State, which is very volcanic. Maybe that's a little more obvious given the active volcanoes in the mountain range there. But the volcanics that give rise to the delicious wines of Washington State are much older than that. They're all part of the Columbia River basalts, if you want to get technical about it. So this was a series of lava flows that came down through the Columbia Basin and literally covered most of southern Washington, wine-growing area of southern Washington in any case, in like about 2 miles thick of solid basalt. You can see it from outer space. There's so much basalt with so much weight that it actually caused a depression in the Earth's crust around the town of Pasco. It's pretty cool. But then subsequent to that, there was a whole series of floods called the Missoula floods. Big lake up further inland. A dam kept forming and then breaking every few thousand years or so ago. So there were about 60-odd flood events that covered that entire volcanic basin with flood sediment. So it's cool. You go to Washington, Columbia River area there. Everything above about 300 meters, 300 feet was the kind of the high level of all these floods is just loose. It's covered sedimentary soil from all these floods. And everything above that is still very volcanic. So I've actually seen cuts in hillsides in Red Mountain, AVA, for example, where down below this one point, it's all thick sandy soils. There's not a rock in sight anywhere. And above that, it's just like pure stone. Although ultra volcanic, you got to go to the right places and start asking the poignant questions. What's the elevation of your vineyard? And then you can determine. Down in the Columbia River area, it's much more volcanic. And that same volcanic spread down into the Willamette Valley in Oregon. Again, similar scenario there where there's lots of sedimentary soils in the lower lying areas and higher parts of, say, Dundee Hills or Yosemite Hills. That's very, very volcanic. But we're talking old volcanics that have weathered into a main soil type called Jory, after a local family. I don't know, dug a lot into the ground. Called the soil type after the family, got to call it something. It's the super rich, red, iron-rich, degraded basalt that gives some pretty amazing Pinot Noirs. And then heading further south, I mentioned already Lake County. So this is north of Napa and Sonoma, actually higher in elevation. In fact, you could stand on the top of Mount St. Helena, northern end of Napa, and you'd be looking up at Mount Konocti and Mount Cobb, which are higher, still active volcanoes in this area. And the lake itself is a caldera lake. It's a volcanic or geologically derived lake. And there, some terrific Cabernet and Sauvignon Blanc. This would be the two flagship varieties that, strangely enough, find their way down into many ultra-premium priced wines from counties further south, not necessarily declared as such. They give more color, they give terrific tannic structure, and that's the fact of growing in volcanic soils, but also at high elevation in a pretty extreme climate. And then down into Napa and Sonoma, as I mentioned earlier, the valley floor, don't expect any volcanics, or at least they'd be way deeper. But up on the hills on either side of the Napa Valley itself, Mayacamas predominantly, but also on the Vaca side. Mayakama side, you have to go further north towards Diamond Mountain, for example. There it gets pretty volcanic. And then on the Sonoma side of the Mayacamas, one of my favorite relatively new AVAs is called Moon Mountain. Have you tasted wines from Moon Mountain?
Oh, yes.
So the AVA petition for that particular appellation was actually drawn on the geology, which is not the case for all AVAs, drawn on the volcanicness of the geology. So yeah, there's some fun stuff there. And Sonoma Mountain has some volcanics and bits and pieces here and there, but it's an area of amazingly mixed geology.
Yeah, I was happy to see the Moon Mountain AVA. I'd had some wines from there before and thought they were distinctly different than wines not that far away. So I was happy to see that one.
And just the last area, I shouldn't leave them out, Sierra foothills.
Oh, yeah.
Because let's not forget the Sierra Nevada, the whole range was caused by tectonic activity. It's Pacific plate diving under North America, causing this little crinkle of pretty large mountains, but a whole arc of volcanoes. So those are long extinct now, but there's lots of volcanic soils, bona fide volcanic soils in the Sierra foothills.
I didn't know that. We get a fair bit here in Los Angeles of Sierra foothill wine, so I will keep that in mind. One question on the Oregon side of things again, is that like in the Dundee Hills, you still have to go above that 300-foot or so level to get to the volcanic soils?
Yeah, in fact, as I recall, the AVA itself kind of starts at 200 feet or 250 feet. There's a minimum elevation level because otherwise it's just generic Willamette Valley or Oregon stuff. But if you go further up, then Dundee Hills is pretty uniformly volcanic. Chehalem Mountains is not, depends on which side of the mountain you're on, because all this wind-blown loess got blown up the Columbia Gorge and deposited on one side. So you see very quickly how things get complicated in the world of geology, and trying to sort them out and draw maps for a book like Volcanic Wines. Worked with some pretty good map makers.
That was why I was asking. I had another producer on recently on the podcast that was based in Yamhill, Carlton, and I feel like up there, everybody will claim that they are able to produce wines from every soil type in the Willamette, so it's like hard to pinpoint where those vineyards are.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Is the Willamette the same thing with the AVA starting above a certain level?
Yeah, for sure. And there, the soil is not Jory predominantly. It's another type called Nikaya. Not to bore you with the soil type names, but it's defined by the depth of soil how far to the bedrock, and the guys are pretty shallow, and there's some other types that are even more shallow. I'm talking like 18 inches or maybe even just a foot of soil before you hit solid rock. So yeah, definitely very volcanic.
Very cool. No, it's not boring at all. That's why we have you here. Cool. Maybe let's go back over to Europe. We already talked about Santorini a little bit. Can we touch on the Canary Islands for a bit? I know there was something that happened there recently. I can't remember if somebody's cellar broke or something. But
they discovered phylloxera.
That too. Yes, I wrote about that as well in our weekly newsletter. That was a big one.
Yeah, no, that's a little alarming, I have to say. Canaries is considered this Jurassic Park of varieties when it was colonized in the 16th century by mostly Iberians, Spaniards and Portuguese. They brought with them all these varieties that existed on the continent at that point and planted them and had their vineyards, made their wine. And many of those varieties went extinct on the mainland during the phylloxera era. So Canaries remained, because it's phylloxera free, or at least was, this kind of haven of all these ancient old varieties that you won't find anywhere else in the world. So the discovery of phylloxera is certainly concerning. But in places like, it's an archipelago, right? It's not just one place, it's many places. You look at the island of Lanzarote. You've seen photos, I'm sure, of this crazy moon landscape, which is just pure black ash with these craters dug out of the ash so that you could plant vines in the original soil, which is in some cases 10, 15 feet lower than this layer of ash. There, phylloxera doesn't stand a chance. It needs clay. It needs to be able to move, and it can't move through sand. It can't move through ash. So I'd say Lanzarote is probably a pretty safe bet for remaining phylloxera-free. Tenerife is the island where it was discovered. It's a little bit older, although they still have a very active and large volcano in El Teide. It's the highest peak under the Spanish flag, 3,300 meters, 12,000 feet in your U.S. parlance. But really older soils with a little bit more clay, which makes it possible, I suppose, for phylloxera to survive and move around.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess that was going to be a question I had for you, because number one, I thought it was a super volcanic soil, so I'm glad to hear there isn't just like a super version of phylloxera out there that's surviving in these.
Not to my knowledge, and I hope not. It doesn't evolve and adapt.
Yeah. And also, my main other concern was for the really old vines that they have there, and just making sure those don't get killed. Fascinating. Is there anywhere else what are the other regions that you're adding to the new book that you would like to touch on, or a region that we haven't spoken about that are doing exciting things?
I mentioned already the Côte d'Aval in central France, and also a little bit further up the Loire River. There's actually an association called Loire Volcanique, and these are pretty obscure appellations like Saint-Pourçain and stuff like that, where you'll find a lot of Gamay, you'll find Chardonnay, you'll find Sauvignon. But I'd like to cover that a little bit more in depth, cover it because it wasn't part of the book. I'd really like to go to Japan, throwing that out there because I have pretty limited experience with Japanese wines, but it's certainly an extremely volcanic region. Mount Fuji is like an archetype, perfect stratovolcano with a beautiful little peak. Grapes grow on its slopes. So I'd like to cover that. I've been, but I'd like to learn a little bit more about North Island of New Zealand, also on the Pacific Ring of Fire and very volcanic. Lots of terrific hot springs and thermal baths if you go to places like Rotorua and Waiheke Island, just off the coast of Auckland. These are all just volcanoes, really. And some pretty delicious wines that I've tasted in that part of the world. And segments of Romania. Again, probably pretty obscure in the U.S., certainly in Canada, Romanian wines, but the same arc of volcanoes that you find across northern Hungary actually carries around into the entire Carpathian Basin and into Romania. So things to be discovered there, no doubt. And where else? What am I missing? I'm probably missing a few other places. British Columbia, in my home country. There's actually an extinct volcano at the northern end of the Okanagan Valley called Mount Boucherie. And wineries like Volcano Ridge and other evocative names like that indicate the volcanic origins, also down in the Similkameen Valley. So there's certainly plenty to cover. And I just learned yesterday that there's a new winery on the Big Island of Hawaii.
Really? Grapes grown there? Or
growing grapes,
Yeah.
Chenin Blanc. It's obviously at very high elevations where it's cool enough to grow grapes in an otherwise tropical place. They do make some pineapple wine, as I understand it, but not only. They've got vinifera growing there in obviously pretty genuine volcanic soils. So what else can we discover? There's obviously a lot more out there, not to mention, as I said earlier, the dozens of new producers or the old producers with the new generation taking over, making terrific wines. These are the things that keep us active and excited.
Yeah. No, I'm looking forward to keeping a finger on the pulse, but I'm also excited that more and more people are coming to appreciate these wines. So hopefully we'll be hearing from you in a lot of different venues and learning more and more about volcanic wines.
Terrific. Oh, I forgot to mention, I got my Volcano t-shirt on that I got in Chile earlier this year. That's another country that I covered, but has evolved immensely in the last dozen years or so ago, discovering cool stuff down in Itata and in the far south and even further south, where it's cool, genuinely cool, and dry farmed vines are very, very common, and terrific old vines as well. Pais, but not only, Sasso, and some other wines that fit the zeitgeist, as you might say, lighter, crunchy, fresh, savory, chill me down sort of red wines.
I didn't realize the Tata was volcanic.
Yeah, not uniformly. Again, the whole coastal range is granite, but there's plenty of volcanic ash that has covered the area, so qualifies in my book. And then some basalt flows if you get closer to the Andes, to the active volcano belt there.
Oh, good to know. We'll keep an eye out for these and more volcanic wines, but thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me on again.
All right. That was Master Sommelier and volcanic wine expert John Szabo. I hope everybody goes out and checks out volcanic wines now. I hope maybe you learned about a new region that you may not have heard about that is volcanic, or maybe you've heard about but you did not know it was volcanic. But for now, that is our episode for this week. We'll be back with another 5 questions on Friday and another full episode next week. Cheers.